Law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of an individual. Thomas Jefferson warned us, the biggest crimes against liberty aren't done in the shadows. They aren't hidden at all. They're done in broad daylight, dressed up in the guise of law and justice and the public good. When the law itself becomes a weapon, no one is safe. So on this episode, warnings we've ignored for far too long. How tyranny hides behind the mask of legality. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, May 16th, 2025. And of course, if we want to understand how tyranny operates, let's start here. No one really admits that they're out there to crush your liberty. Well, not too often. They generally try to dress it up. Every single usurpation, every exercise of unconstitutional power, every time they violate the rights of an individual, they try to give it the stamp of law. And John Dickinson nailed it in the 6th of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767. He said, all artful rulers, and that sounds redundant, but we'll go with it. All artful rulers who strive to extend their power beyond its just limits endeavor to give their attempts as much semblance of legality as possible. And the anti-federalist writer Federal Farmer gave us the same kind of warning years later in 1787. He wrote, men who govern will in doubtful cases construe laws and constitutions most favorably for increasing their own powers. So when a person with power tells you that what they're doing is legal, you should be, well, pretty skeptical, even if they make a pretty good case of it, because they're good at doing that kind of thing, and that's how they've done these things all throughout history. And here really is the sad truth. A lot of people actually love that kind of stuff. Most people are just happy with appearances rather than reality. Hearing something is constitutional or legal or just, whether it is or not, they're totally fine with that. And as Machiavelli put it, I think back in the early 16th century when he first wrote it, people have obviously fallen for this all throughout history. He said the great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances, as though they were realities, and are often even more influenced by the things that seem than by those that are. And that's exactly how tyranny survives and thrives, under layers and layers and layers of illusion and, well, make-believe. 2 centuries later, John Trenchard made the exact same case here in Cato's Letters, number 9, December 31st, 1720. He said, the most successful deluders and oppressors of mankind have always acted in masquerade. And when the blackest villainies are meant, the most opposite spirit is pretended. Man, those terms that he used, just not holding back at all. Deluders, oppressors, masquerade, and pretend. He said vice acts with security and often with reputation under the veil of virtue. And just a few weeks later, he picked up the same message again in letter number 13 in early 1721. Of course, the arts of misleading people by sounds. That was a great title for this essay, January 21st, 1721. He said, yet even in countries where the highest liberty is allowed and the greatest light shines, you generally find certain men and bodies of men set apart to mislead the multitude. And if you're like me, you've got to be thinking at some point as I go through this, holy cow, that sounds really familiar, because it does. Anyways, he continued, who are ever abused with words, ever fond of the worst things recommended by good names, and ever abhor the best things, and the most virtuous actions disfigured by ill names. So they love the bad stuff, they propagandize in support of all the bad stuff, and all the good stuff is always treated as absolute garbage. And of course, they twist the language to get it done. Change the words, change the meaning of the words, and you can change what people actually see or believe to be good and evil. He said, one of the great arts, therefore, of cheating men is to study the application and misapplication of sounds. A few loud words rule the majority. I had almost said the whole world. And he probably would have been right saying it as the whole world, because people have fallen for this type of thing all throughout history. And I think maybe the best example that we have seen how this has played out under our own Constitution for the United States comes from Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and Chief Justice John Marshall, when they told us that the word necessary didn't actually mean necessary. Instead, it meant convenient. And as Thomas Jefferson warned when he argued against this interpretation by Hamilton to justify the unconstitutional First National Bank, he said, there's nothing that government can't torture into a convenience in one situation or another. So if you argue that necessary just means convenient in the necessary and proper clause, you're basically arguing for unlimited power. Now, I covered that twist in a recent episode, Necessary and Proper, the big lie that unleashed big government. And that might be even an understatement, because it has been the fountain of almost total power, the largest government in the history of the world. Now, I'm mentioning a number of things, original source documents. I've got 2 episodes at least that I think off the top of my head I'm going to be referencing in this episode. This will all be included in the show notes for the blog post, which we published for every single episode. Alan Mosley gets those organized, and I get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty a couple of hours after the live stream is done. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. At the top of every blog post, you're going to get, of course, the title and a quick overview, and then the audio player, video player. But then the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a show links section where you're going to find all the stuff that I'm mentioning and referencing in the episode, generally in the order that I go through it. And that way, if you're interested, I'm just scratching the surface here. You're going to have all the source documents and articles and episodes so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Again, that'll be published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But let's get back to it. Algernon Sidney, in his discourses concerning government, we know he was beheaded. He was put to death for writing this, not even publishing it. They found it in his home, and they killed him for it. He was considered a martyr for liberty, a hero to the American revolutionaries. And Thomas Jefferson later called his book the best elementary book on government based or grounded in natural law ever written in any language. It's not the easiest reading, but it's really, really important stuff. And he saw this twisting of the language for what it was, a deadly trap, a way to kill liberty and, well, ultimately kill people as well. He said, all poison, again, it's deadly, all poison must be disguised, and no man can be persuaded to eat arsenic unless it be covered with something that appears to be harmless. And that's how law is often but the tyrant's will, but it's the law. Just because it's the law doesn't mean it's just or it's actually legal. It's just what the tyrant has happened to be saying about it. And it's almost never, all throughout history, again, it's almost never open and honest tyranny. They're not just coming out and say that they're being tyrants. There's always some kind of noble-sounding excuse, something wrapped up in supporting freedom or protecting you or the public good. And James Otis Jr., writing as Freeborn American in April of 1767, he saw through all of it. He said, "There is scarce an instance to be found in the English history where tyranny has been bold enough to declare her purposes and not endeavored to cloak herself with the sacred veil of public good." Well, they can't keep up the facade forever. Sooner or later, we the people learn who the man is behind the curtain, but it's not always a good result. That fake respectability, though, it ends, and law becomes a total weapon for violence and control. And James Iredell, one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court, he put it like this in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. This is in the summer of 1788. He said, "This is the foundation on which persecution has been raised in every part of the world. The people in power were always right, and everybody else wrong." And as Thomas Gordon, back to Cato's letters, this is number 57 in 1721, he pointed out, well, the result is always the same, and it's not a good result at all. He said, "Men have been ever deceived by good names into an approbation of ill things, sanctified by these names. Imposture and delusion have been called religion, and thought so. Oppression and rapine have been called government, and esteemed government." So oppression is just, well, that's just government, and this is just them doing their job, but it's oppression. "Teachers," he wrote, "have denigrated into deceivers, submission into slavery, taxation into plundering, protection into destruction, and magistrates into murderers without changing their names." Now, I don't agree on the positive end of all these things that he's referencing, but it certainly really hammers it home that things that are supposed to be there for, well, we can call it for justice, for the public good, for protecting liberty, have been twisted and perverted into something that destroys all of them. Magistrates into murderers. Taxation was always plundering, but that's a whole different episode as well. And when the masks finally fall, here's what goes down. Law isn't just twisted, it's totally weaponized. Whole cities get looted. Tyranny just goes full throttle. And then the criminals, the politicians, the judges, their supporters, their sycophants, they just call it justice or freedom or security, whatever they want to use. And hear from Jean Barbeyrac, who was putting out a translated edition of The Rights of War and Peace, which was originally written by Grotius, Hugo de Groot in the early 17th century, and Jean's edition was 1724. Here he is paraphrasing Philo of Alexandria. "When they have the power in their own hands and can assure themselves of impunity, they plunder whole cities and commit the greatest robberies under the specious name of government. They lie. They steal, they plunder, they destroy lives, and, well, over the years, they've murdered people by the millions and millions and millions, and then they strut around like they're the good guys, protecting us, saving us, advancing our freedoms and our prosperity. But this has always been a scam. We can even go back to the ancients, where Cicero, in his On Moral Duties, which, of course, like everything else, will be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. But this he wrote in around 40 or 45 BC. He put it like this: "But of all forms of injustice, none is more heinous than that of the men who, while they practice fraud to the utmost of their ability, do it in such a way that they appear to be good men." Thomas Jefferson was right. Law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of an individual. And with that in mind, if that's our foundation, I would have to say that most so-called laws, rules, regulations, and orders on the books today and for our entire life have been, well, the tyrant's will, because they almost all violate the rights of an individual. But ultimately, tyranny just disguised as law, tyranny disguised as justice, it can only win when the people comply, when the people just go along with it, when they refuse to resist it. And I think Lysander Spooner nailed this better than almost anyone. Resistance is really the only way to keep any government in check, to push back on any form of tyranny. He put it like this: It's a defense of the natural rights of the people against robbers and trespassers who attempt to set up their own personal authority and power in opposition to those of the Constitution and people which they were appointed to administer. Now, if you're interested in more of that kind of message, you're in luck, because I got an episode on this from last year. Lysander Spooner, Radical Truths on Tyranny and the Constitution. That'll be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I am pretty confident that this is not the kind of thing that most people have learned or are learning in the government-run and government-approved school system. And that's a huge part of the reason why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles from the founders, from the old revolutionaries, and from the people that they read and learned from. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that's quickly devaluing day in and day out, year in and year out, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, it's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options available, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And if you don't want to become a member but still want to pitch in and support us financially, that is really awesome. Or if you already are a member, I'm very grateful for that, but want to help out a little bit more, no pressure at all. But I know people ask about this, so I always want to make sure you have the URL available so you can get that done. 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. There's also a bunch of free and easy peasy things that you can do to help us spread the word, primarily by triggering the algorithms of the mainstream platforms you may watch or listen on, like hitting the like button, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archives, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, and especially on places like YouTube. Watch time percentage is a huge one. So if it's a 10-minute video and you watch 10 minutes, that's 100%. But if you watch 18 minutes, that's 180%. And yes, I still have a little bit of math skill once in a while, even though I went to the government-run schools myself. But I really appreciate any effort you can do to help us spread the word. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something. That's more important than anything. And I hope you have an awesome weekend. I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.